Are you cautious about flying in weather? You may think you are, but how do you know for sure? Today we're talking about an accident involving a pilot who was described as cautious about weather, but he pressed on anyway and crashed. I'll share what an NTSB study found about which pilots are most at risk for weather-related accidents, and I'll give you a few simple ways to estimate visibility and cloud clearance. Also, if you need a new headset sometime in the coming months, you may want to jump on a discount that Lightspeed is offering during the holidays that'll save you money. All right, let's get started. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 403, we talked about the UPS MD-11 crash in Louisville, and we talked with Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro about how to make better landings. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/403. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We'd love to have you back here every week. So to do that, in whatever app that you're using, touch the subscribe key, or if you're using Spotify or the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Now see if you know any of these people who've signed up in the past week to support Aviation News Talk. New monthly supporters via Patreon include Doug McElveen, David Z., and Sam Ellis. And if you are the kind of person who tips your waiter, your barista, and your Uber driver, why not tip your podcast host? And when you do, I'll read your name in next week's episode. You can sign up to support the show now by going to aviationnewstalk.com/support. Coming up in the news for the week of November 10th, 2025, we've just had 3 parachute pulls in 3 days, and they weren't all Cirrus aircraft. A hurricane relief flight crashes in Florida, and we have more details of the pilot who tried to cut the engines on an Alaska Air flight. All this and more, and the news starts now. And let's lead off with good news. 3 parachute pulls in 3 days. The most recent, a Lancer 4P, November 163 Bravo Romeo, sustained substantial damage in a landing following the deployment of its parachute while on approach to land at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia. The aircraft ended up on a golf course on Thursday night. Savannah police confirmed that there were 2 people inside the aircraft who were uninjured. The pilot and passenger refused to be taken to the hospital. And on the day before, Wednesday, November the 13th, November 79 Echo Mike, a Cirrus SR-22, experienced engine issues and deployed its CAPS parachute in Teague, Texas. There were 2 people on board and no injuries. That aircraft had departed from the Hooks Airport, KDWH. And on Tuesday, November 866 Charlie Delta, the Cirrus SR-20 sustained substantial damage when it came to rest in a heavily wooded terrain following a loss of engine power and a parachute deployment while on approach to land at St. Louis Airport, KSUS, in Chesterfield, Missouri. The 2 occupants were uninjured. And I know a lot of pilots in the past have poo-pooed the use of parachutes, but I hear less of it these days, probably because of the outstanding record. And I hope to live long enough to see the day when there are more parachute pulls each year than there are fatal accidents. From avweb.com, a Beechcraft King Air B-100 bound for Montego Bay, Jamaica on a hurricane relief flight crashed on Monday into a body of water near Coral Springs, Florida. The twin turboprop, built in 1976 and registered to International Air Services of Carson City, Nevada, went down about 10:15 a.m. Coral Springs Fire Department Deputy Chief Mike Moser told Local 10 that crews received multiple 911 calls reporting a low-flying aircraft. Dive teams entered the water but were unable to recover large sections of wreckage or locate any victims. NTSB data shows that the aircraft took off on its relief flight from Fort Lauderdale Executive at about 10:14 a.m., just 1 minute before the crash. Local METAR data from Fort Lauderdale and surrounding airports indicated moderate winds and ceilings around 2,000 feet or higher. Boca Raton's report noted nearby towering cumulus clouds around the time of the crash. From avweb.com, GA adapts as FAA adjusts restrictions. GA operators are adjusting following the FAA's amended emergency order on Thursday. The revised order lowers required flight reductions at 40 high-impact airports from 10% to 6% and follows controller staffing improvements as the U.S. government shutdown ends. Certain restrictions remained in place, though, including potential reductions of up to 10% for general aviation during staffing trigger events and general aviation prohibitions at 12 of the busiest airports except for based aircraft and various emergency services. AOPA called the earlier measure to bar GA flights from certain airports a disproportionate response to the shutdown and emphasized that any reductions should be equitable and tied solely to safety considerations, not economic ones. As the FAA continues reviewing system performance, the agency said it may adjust limits as needed and expects to roll back restrictions as system conditions improve. From avbrief.com, fire destroys 3 aircraft at Avon Park, Florida. 3 aircraft were destroyed in what looks like a case of arson at Avon Park Executive near Sebring, Florida on Tuesday. A Cessna 150, a Cherokee 140, and another single, possibly a Cherokee, were involved. Officials have not released a cause, but the fires were centered on the cabins of each of the 3 aircraft, and photos of the aftermath suggest the fires occurred individually and did not spread from any single aircraft. A news release by the city of Avon Park confirmed the fire but offered no further details. The fires were reported at about 10:40 p.m. on Tuesday. The Avon Park Fire Department was able to keep the blazes from spreading to 2 other airplanes. Avon Park is about 10 miles north of Sebring, Florida. From KRDO.com, business jet that crashed in Michigan was flown after pilots chose not to wait for a test pilot. And this comes from the preliminary NTSB report, which says that the pilots were performing a test flight themselves following repairs instead of waiting for a test pilot when the aircraft plunged into woods near Lansing, Michigan. The Mexican-registered Raytheon Hawker 800XP crashed in Bath Township, Michigan on October 16th, killing the 3 aboard. The work involved removing part of the wing, which requires pilots to test fly it in an aerodynamic stall before it could be returned to service. When the crew arrived to pick up the plane, the company that did the maintenance work suggested that they hire a test pilot to perform the test. However, after being unable to coordinate the stall test flight with a test pilot, the flight crew elected to perform the post-maintenance stall test themselves. 2 pilots working for the jet owner and their maintenance representatives were killed in the crash. The NTSB noted that the pilot's manual for the plane said pilots conducting stall tests, quote, should have prior experience in performing stalls in the Hawker and must be prepared for unacceptable stall behavior at any point. From generalaviationnews.com, pilot presses wrong lever in unfamiliar plane. Now, this is a Know Your Airplane story. It's also a cautionary tale on one of the reasons that so many accidents occur to people who've just purchased an airplane. The pilot purchased the van's RV4 the day before the accident. During a landing at the airport in London, Kentucky, the aircraft bounced. The pilot intended to abort the landing. However, he accidentally advanced the elevator trim lever rather than the throttle lever, which were similarly positioned in shape. The aircraft touched down a second time, nose low, resulting in damage to the main landing gear and propeller. Several fuselage tubes were also substantially damaged. Probable cause: the pilot's inadvertent application of nose-down pitch trim during the attempted aborted landing, which resulted in abnormal contact with the runway. And this comes from a final NTSB report, November 5-9 Bravo Romeo, a Challenger 1 experimental aircraft. The pilot was having difficulty controlling the airplane's rudder pedals due to his physical stature. After several taxi attempts up and down the runway, he elected to take off for a short flight. After becoming airborne, the pilot began to have yaw controllability problems. He attempted to land but was unable to control the airplane's movement as his knees were contacting the instrument panel and his feet were wedged behind the rudder pedals. The airplane continued to fly over terrain about 6 feet above ground level. With trees approaching, the pilot pushed the nose of the airplane down, resulting in a hard landing. The airplane sustained substantial damage. Probable cause: the pilot's decision to take off, despite having problems controlling the airplane due to his physical stature. From avweb.com, Joby test military hybrid VTOL. Joby Aviation announced on Thursday that it's completed the first flight of its turbine-electric autonomous VTOL demonstrator designed for both commercial and military use. The aircraft flew on November 7th at Joby's Marina, California facility, 3 months after the hybrid platform was first announced. Built on Joby's electric air taxi design, the demonstrator incorporates a turbine-powered generator to extend range and payload for missions that may include future defense operations. The aircraft is part of Joby's partnership with L3Harris Technologies to adapt the hybrid VTOL for U.S. government needs. According to L3Harris, the platform is intended to support roles such as congested logistics, low-altitude support, and loyal wingman operations. Joby noted that the U.S. government has requested more than $9 billion in the fiscal 2026 budget for the next generation autonomous and hybrid aircraft. From WBIR.com, helicopter pilot pleads guilty in 2021 Tennessee crash that killed passenger. A Utah man at the controls of a helicopter that crashed in December 2021 in Tennessee, killing his passenger, has pleaded guilty in her death. Matthew Jones will face sentencing on March 23rd. He pleaded guilty Wednesday to criminally negligent homicide in the death of Julianne Wagner Garretson. Jones had been warned in the days before the crash by a federal judge in Utah not to fly. He did it anyway, traveling to Tennessee in December 2021 with Garretson to pick up a helicopter he was interested in using for a new business. Jones crashed the R-44 during drizzly, overcast conditions. Garretson died and Jones suffered paralyzing injuries. A grand jury indicted Jones in the death in March 2023. Jones has previously pleaded guilty in federal court in his home state to duping people into believing he was a CFI. As part of that plea deal, he served a year in custody with credit for time he had already spent behind bars. After his release, he was placed on 36 months supervised release. During that time, authorities said he improperly left Utah at least twice in late 2023 without permission from the court or probation office. As a result of violating terms of that release, the federal court in Salt Lake City in September 2024 sentenced him to serve a year in prison. And finally, from paddleyourown.canoe.com, new details have been released about the sleep-deprived Alaska Airlines pilot who attempted to kill the engines of a packed plane mid-flight in October 2023 after consuming magic mushrooms during a remembrance gathering for his best friend who had recently died from an untreated heart problem. Joseph Emerson is due to be sentenced after reaching a plea deal with prosecutors in which he pleaded guilty to a single charge of interference with flight crew members in attendance. The court has the power to impose a maximum sentence of 20 years imprisonment and $250,000 fine. Prosecutors are, however, calling for him to be sentenced to 6 months of home detention. But in a new petition to the court, his defense attorneys want this dropped in favor of probation. The petition contains new details about what led to the events of Alaska Flight 2059. Approximately 48 hours before boarding the flight, Emerson had been at a remembrance ceremony for his recently deceased best friend. He was struggling to process his friend's death, and rather than seeking formal mental health treatment, fearing he might lose his flying certificate, he took magic mushrooms. Emerson had never taken magic mushrooms before, but as he wasn't scheduled to operate a flight for another 6 days, he didn't think this would interfere with his professional responsibilities. He thought the effects of the mushrooms would wear off within 8 hours. Even after mushrooms had worn off, Emerson was detached from reality and felt like he was in a dream he couldn't escape. Before boarding the flight, Emerson was convinced his family was in danger and was desperate to get home. Quote, he believed he was either trapped in a dream or already dead. He got on the airplane because, though he believed the airplane was not real, it was a step toward waking up from his nightmare and seeing his family. Emerson was allowed to sit in the cockpit on a fold-down jump seat. On the flight home, he became increasingly suspicious that the plane would never make it home and that he would endlessly fly, never reaching his destination. Emerson was convinced that he was in a dream and had to wake up immediately. To do so, he pulled the emergency shut-off handles to both engines. The operating pilots quickly intervened before Emerson could completely shut off the engines and got him out of the cockpit. Once in police custody, Emerson continued to try to wake himself up, banging his head against the concrete wall of his holding cell and repeatedly hitting himself. It took several days for Emerson to return to reality. During his time in custody, he came to realize he was an alcoholic and would have never taken the mushrooms if it had not been for the fact that he was drinking. Emerson has turned his attention to improving mental health resources for pilots and has started a nonprofit with his wife called Clear Skies Ahead. And that's the story of the magic mushrooms. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk about a weather-related accident and why pilots are sometimes not as cautious as they think they are. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now, let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Ken Slasky. He writes, Max, proud to announce I earned the designation Master Instructor for the second time from both NAFI and from Master Instructors. I'm a loyal listener to all three podcasts, Aviation News Talk, The Rotary Wing Show, and NTSB News Talk. And Ken, there's a fourth one we have too. That's UAV News Talk. I take so much from these podcasts and apply this knowledge not only to my flying, but I share it with all my students as well. Thanks for all you do to help improve aviation safety. Thank you, Ken. And Ken was our guest back on episode 398 when he talked about his experiences as NYPD's chief pilot managing helicopter operations on 9/11. And as you know, I write for Flying Magazine, and about 8 weeks after a new column was published, they put it out on the web, and the most recent one is now available. They've titled it, How to Eliminate Approach Key Confusion for Pilots. We talked about this on the show here a while back, about how people get confused about the APR key with the autopilot. Anyway, it's now available on the web, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes. In a moment, I'll tell you about my recent trip to Colorado in an SR-22, but first, it's the holiday season, and if you'd like to have a new headset or two, and who wouldn't, you may want to do what I occasionally do, and that's to buy a Christmas gift for yourself. And you can save some cash if you buy it now. Here's the deal. Lightspeed's top-of-the-line headset is the Delta Zulu, and for the first time, they are discounting that model over the holidays. Now, that headset is normally $12.99, but from now until January 12th, you can get $100 off, which brings the price down to $11.99, which is a great price for a noise-canceling headset that also includes a CO monitor and a frequency equalizer that lets you tune the headset to compensate for any hearing loss you may have. And here's what you do to get that discount. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/lightspeed and click on the first link, which will get you $100 off the Lightspeed Delta Zulu. And if you want to get two of them, you'll save $200. Just remember to go to aviationnewstalk.com/lightspeed and order before January 12th, 2026. And I mentioned in episode 402 that I had a 3-day trip in an SR-22T with an owner coming up the day after I released that episode. And I said that first we were flying to Colorado, where he'd be looking at an airplane that he's in the process of buying. Then we'd fly up to Montana, where we'd spend a day and a half. And then we'd probably be home on Monday night. I said the weather looked good for the beginning of the trip, though there might be some rain in Montana toward the end of the trip. Now, the trip worked out extremely well, but perhaps not for the reasons you might guess. It worked out well because my client exercised outstanding judgment every time we faced any kind of issue on the trip. There were two gentlemen on the trip, the airplane owner and someone who works for him. Both of them are pilots, and I've flown with both of them before. Neither of them had flown a lot recently for various reasons, which is why they brought me along on the trip. So I think that was the first excellent example of good judgment. If you're not proficient, bring along a CFI. Or if you're going on a really long trip, as we'll talk about during our main topic in a few minutes, bring along a CFI, or at least bring along another pilot who is proficient. We flew first from Palo Alto, California to Longmont, Colorado, with a stop in Wendover, Utah to refuel. Now, Wendover is an excellent refueling stop. It's west of Salt Lake City on the Nevada-Utah border. The airport's in Utah, and most of the town, including the casino, is on the Nevada side of the border. And there are, or perhaps were, a number of 1940s barracks, so it's been the set for several movies, including Independence Day. Also at the airport, they have one of the aircraft that was used in the movie Con Air, and you can climb around in it and see what it's like. The terminal building also has a museum area with many World War II aviation-related artifacts. They also have a large gift shop where you can get all kinds of gifts for family and friends. Now, I've been to the airport, I'm guessing a half dozen times, and I've never seen it busy, so refueling is very quick. So if you're flying along Interstate 80, you might want to consider it as a fuel stop. Our first leg was 3.3 hours. Next, we flew a 2.6-hour leg to Longmont, Colorado, where the owner went to inspect a Commander 114 that he had purchased. Now, it was in really excellent shape. It was one of the last ones built. So it was fun to look at it, and we talked to the mechanics who'd been working on it. From there, we were planning to go that evening to Bozeman, Montana, and that flight would have been around 2.5 hours, and we'd be arriving well after dark. The weather would be good, and Bozeman has long runways, so those weren't issues. However, after we arrived, we would have had to drive for an hour and a half on mountain roads to get to the cabin we were headed to. Now, I wasn't too worried about the night flight, but with an hour and a half of driving, I knew we wouldn't be getting in until after 10 p.m., after a long day of many hours flying. And that's when the owner said he didn't feel the need to be in Bozeman that night, and that we could just as easily find a hotel to stay in at Longmont. Now, that was excellent judgment, as had we gone to Bozeman, we would have been totally exhausted after 8 hours of flying and an hour and a half of driving on windy mountain roads. Instead, we got to the hotel in the early evening, had a nice dinner, and got to bed early, which meant we didn't go to bed exhausted and we were well rested in the morning. The next day, we were still planning to go to Bozeman. The weather on the first half of the trip would be clear, but as we got closer to Bozeman, there would be clouds and icing up to flight level 160 or 170. No problem. We were in a Fiki-capable SR-22T that can go as high as flight level 250. So my first pass plan was that we'd choose an altitude above the clouds so that we stayed above the ice, only encountering it on our descent into Bozeman. And here's where the owner made the second great choice on the trip. He said he didn't really need to go to Bozeman and suggested that we instead go back to Palo Alto a day early and skip the ice and weather in Montana. So while I'm sure we could have made the trip, I felt it was really excellent judgment to choose to fly home in clear skies versus deal with the ice. We did have a 40-knot headwind for much of the way back, and I do remember seeing the ground speed drop at one point to 121 knots. So it was slow coming home, but we had all day to do it, so it wasn't a big deal. And we may plan a separate trip to Montana later in the year. Now, one interesting thing about the Commander was that its autopilot was a King Bendix KFC 200. And coincidentally, after we got back, I came across an accident that was caused by runaway trim of that model of autopilot. It's an interesting accident, and we'll be talking about it next week in episode 17 of the NTSB News Talk podcast. It reinforces what I've often said, which is that you want to know everything possible about your airplane and avionics. No detail is too small to know, as you never know which one of these minor details could help you avoid an accident. And by the way, the autopilot in the Commander is probably at least 25 years old, so I've suggested that they take a look at buying a newer autopilot, something like the Garmin 500. Now, in a moment, I'm going to be talking about an accident that occurred because a pilot continued flying into bad weather. I recorded that segment earlier, and I just want to mention a few things that I didn't include in it, so please think about these issues as you listen to our main topic in a few moments. One issue is optimism bias, and I think this is always an issue for pilots. As pilots, we often believe it won't happen to me or I'll be able to handle this because we've flown sometimes in marginal conditions before without incident. For example, one study found that many CFIs did not consider flying to be risky, even though statistically it is, which is a form of denial. Another issue is normalization of deviance. If a pilot has flown in or near questionable weather many times before without mishap, the deviant behavior becomes normalized. We think, I did it before, nothing bad happened, so it isn't that risky. According to research, prior experience that didn't lead to a bad outcome reduces perceived risk. And of course, get there-itis is always an issue. Research in weather decision-making shows that time pressure changes risk behavior. And there's often a mismatch between a pilot's own personal minimums and actual situations. Many pilots say they have personal weather minimums, but studies show they often don't stick to them. One study found exactly that. Pilots often did not adhere to their set minimums. So a pilot may think they are cautious because they have minimums, but when the real world intervenes, such as weather changes and so on, the actual decisions drift. Another issue is cognitive dissonance. If a pilot sees themselves as careful about weather, then when they make a less than ideal decision, they may unconsciously reinterpret that behavior, saying to themselves it was just a small risk, so that they can keep their self-image. This leads to a mismatch between what they intended to do versus what they actually did. And if a pilot has already flown the first leg or committed to a destination, there is a psychological reluctance to turn back or cancel. A distance flown study shows that prior commitment increases risky decisions. Thus, even a cautious pilot may reach a point of no return. So keep those things in mind as we talk about our main topic, which is coming up next. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. I am sure that we all believe we are cautious about flying in weather, but do our actions match those beliefs? Let's talk about the accident that started me thinking about this issue, and then we'll talk about an NTSB study that researched the kind of pilots that are most likely to have weather-related accidents. And finally, we'll talk about ways you can estimate visibility and your distance from clouds while in flight. And if you learned something from this episode, please share it with all of your pilot friends, especially those who might be lower-time pilots. Now, this accident involved November 21480, a 1978 Piper PA 28161, which is an Archer. The accident occurred on March 25, 2023 at 12:51 p.m. local time in Johns Island, South Carolina. The pilot was a 66-year-old male who had 740 hours total time. He had a private certificate but was not instrument rated. The pilot was on a very long trip, flying by himself from Maine to Florida to meet friends at the annual Sun and Fun Expo in Florida. And those facts are consistent with something I've long observed, which is that many fatal accidents, especially weather-related accidents, happen far from home when pilots are on long trips. Here's what the final NTSB report says in part. A review of ATC communications and NTSB flight tracking data revealed he departed Machias, Maine about 8:20 a.m., made 2 fuel stops, and landed at Tarboro Edgecombe Airport, that's ETC, in Tarboro, North Carolina, about 6 p.m. local. According to the pilot's wife, the pilot spent the night in the pilot's lounge. The following morning, about 8:14 a.m., he departed for the Conroy-Horry County Airport, HYW, in Conroy, South Carolina, and landed about 10:43 a.m. According to an employee at HYW, the pilot said that he was headed to Sun and Fun and had been fighting a strong headwind the entire trip. The pilot appeared tired, and the employee could see fatigue in his eyes. The pilot checked the AWOS and mentioned that he might stay the night and wait out approaching weather. However, the employee saw the pilot walk out to his airplane, check the fuel, and depart. The pilot departed HYW at 11:56 a.m. for the Palatka Municipal Airport, that's 28J, in Palatka, Florida, and climbed to an altitude of 1,600 feet MSL. He was in contact with ATC and receiving flight following. At 12:43 p.m., a controller asked the pilot if he wanted to remain at 1,600 feet or climb to a higher altitude. The pilot said that he wanted to stay low to maintain VFR, quote, due to any clouds up ahead. The controller acknowledged and said, maintain VFR, altitude your discretion. 8 minutes later at 12:51, the controller noticed the plane started to turn right and descend. The controller asked the pilot if he was maneuvering to stay below the clouds. The pilot responded, quote, Mayday, Mayday, in the clouds, I'm going down. This was the last communication from the pilot. The witness heard the airplane's engine and looked up. He said the airplane was descending straight down, nose first, at a high rate of speed. He said the weather was overcast with low clouds, like when it rains. A second witness said the weather was overcast and, quote, almost as if it was going to rain. Review of weather information indicated that the accident site was located just east of an outflow boundary. Satellite imagery indicated that a 2-mile wide, 10 to 15-mile long area of clouds extended along the coastline in the area of the accident site, with cloud tops about 3,500 feet MSL. A text airmet and a graphical or G airmet were also issued for moderate turbulence. The weather conditions were forecast to worsen with the approaching thunderstorm activity an hour or two after the accident time frame. An automated surface weather observation from the Charleston Executive Airport, JZI, located about 2 miles north-northeast of the accident site, at 12:55 p.m. reported an overcast ceiling at 1,300 feet AGL and 10-mile visibility. Review of archived information indicated that the pilot did not request a weather briefing through the Leidos flight service. According to information provided by ForeFlight, the pilot accessed his ForeFlight account and updated the route about 11:30 a.m. on the day of the accident. However, he did not file a flight plan or obtain a weather briefing through the service. Probably the most interesting insight into this accident comes from the NTSB interview with the pilot's wife. It includes her name, but I'll just refer to her as Mrs. P. Otherwise, I'll read it in full. It says, according to Mrs. P., her husband had traveled to Sun and Fun on numerous occasions and was familiar with the route of flight between Machias, Maine and Lakeland, Florida. And by the way, I read online that he had been flying to Sun and Fun annually since 2017, so this would have been his 6th or 7th trip there. He departed Maine around 8 a.m. and landed in Tarboro, North Carolina about 6 p.m. Mrs. P. said she talked to her husband the night before the accident. He had ordered food via Uber Eats and was staying on a couch in the airport's pilot lounge. Mrs. P. said her husband always carried camping equipment and guitars, and staying overnight at airports was normal for him. During the conversation, the pilot never mentioned that he was tired, just that it was a long day due to weather. She said he was very cautious about flying in weather and had even thought about canceling the trip due to weather conditions along the route of flight. He had been monitoring the weather right up until the morning he departed. The pilot made a short video with his iPhone before he departed Tarboro. In the video, he said that from the time he landed to the time he got up, he never saw anyone at the airport except for the guy that delivered his food around 8 to 8:30 p.m. Mrs. P said that her husband would normally call her before he departed, but he did not call her or anyone else that morning. It was very unusual for him not to call her. However, he did text the friends he was meeting in Florida the day before the accident to let them know that if he encountered weather en route, he would be delayed. Mrs. P said her husband kept his phone turned off while flying to avoid being distracted. She said the airplane was equipped with NTSB. They had a receiver in their home in Maine, and she was actively tracking him. Mrs. P watched the accident in real time and knew that he had crashed. In fact, she is the one that called 911 and the airport to confirm if he indeed crashed. Mrs. P said she also received a call from the Air Force that the ELT was going off. Mrs. P stated that her husband would normally go to sleep around 9 to 10 p.m. and be up early, make coffee, and get their children ready for school. Normal sleep was 6 to 7 hours. He was in good general health and liked to run for exercise on the weekends. He took medication for high blood pressure and cholesterol. Mrs. P said that she and her husband owned a boat chartering business in Cutler, Maine. She said he seemed happy despite the stressors of owning a business. And by the way, I looked at the NTSB track for this accident. The pilot started the final flight at 1,600 feet, but progressively got lower. At the end of the flight, he was at 800 feet. During the final 40 seconds, he started a right turn and turned about 360 degrees. He was roughly level throughout that turn until he began losing altitude rapidly in the final 5 seconds, during which he was descending at about 5,000 feet per minute. So what strikes you about this accident? It has a lot of elements that we often read about in accidents. This was a non-instrument rated pilot on a long trip. It was a trip he'd done numerous times before, and things had apparently always worked out before. The weather was questionable, and the pilot considered canceling the trip. In fact, he considered not taking off on the final leg, but he pressed on anyway. He was motivated to complete the trip because he was meeting with friends, and although he'd been checking weather before the trip, there's no evidence he got an update on the weather on the day of the accident. One tragedy about the accident is that the pilot had just passed an airport, which was 1.5 miles from where he crashed. The turn that he made after entering the clouds was actually fairly good compared to what I see in most spatial disorientation accidents. His altitude remained mostly level, and the turn radius was fairly constant until the very end. My guess is that the pilot was attempting to make a 180-degree turn to exit the clouds he'd entered and to land at the airport he had just passed. Now, making a 180-degree turn is a good strategy if you find you've inadvertently entered clouds. Ideally, you'd do that using an autopilot. Though this was a 1970s Piper Archer, it was not shipped with an autopilot, and the NTSB ground track for the prior 2 days was erratic enough to indicate that the plane was being hand-flown. Of course, a better strategy is to avoid inadvertently entering clouds, but sometimes that happens despite our best efforts. I know. I have over 12,000 hours, and it's happened to me at least twice that I recall. In both cases, I was near the San Francisco Bay, so there was no terrain, and I knew that by descending gently, I'd be quickly out of the clouds. Plus, I had the advantage of being instrument rated, and I was a CFI, so I was proficient at flying in instruments. So, avoiding clouds is by far the best strategy. But if you find yourself in them, get on the instruments. In the case of the South Carolina crash, the pilot's actions, making a 100-degree level turn, made sense. But unfortunately, he didn't roll out of the turn after he turned 180 degrees, and he ultimately lost control. Studies show that on average, a non-instrument pilot that flies into clouds will lose control after about 3 minutes. This pilot appears to have been in the clouds for approximately a minute before losing control. This accident reminds me in some ways of a fatal accident that occurred in one of our club planes. 2 couples from Australia rented 2 of our planes and flew to Alaska. One pilot was instrument rated and in a Cirrus. The other was not instrument rated, and he was in a Saratoga. One day, the 2 pilots departed from an airport in Alaska. The non-instrument rated pilot took off, but landed again because of weather. But then later he changed his mind and took off again and crashed. So again, a very long trip, a non-instrument rated pilot who was motivated to continue, but who misjudged the weather. So you might wonder what kind of pilots are most likely to find themselves in a weather-related accident. And how do these pilots differ from pilots who don't have weather-related accidents? While doing research, I came across an NTSB study that's relevant. It's called Risk Factors Associated with Weather-Related GA Accidents. It's called SS-05/01, and it was published in 2005. It says that the goal of the study was to better understand the risk factors associated with accidents that occur in weather conditions characterized by IMC or poor visibility, in other words, weather-related accidents. So this study is exactly about the kind of accident that we're talking about. The study compared a group of weather-related GA accidents with non-accident GA flights that occurred under similar conditions in the same area, around the same time, under the same flight rules, and in aircraft types that were similar to identify risk factors. Investigators collected data from 72 GA accidents that occurred between August 2003 and April 2004. When accidents occurred, study managers also contacted pilots of flights that were operating in the vicinity at the time of those accidents for information about their flight activity. A total of 135 non-accident flights were included in the study. All non-accident pilots voluntarily consented to interviews and provided information about their flights, their aircraft, and details about their training, experience, and demographics. Additionally, the FAA provided information about pilots' practical and written test results and their previous accident/incident involvement. Statistical analyses were used to determine the relationship between study variables and accident/non-accident status, and to identify variables that could be linked to an increased risk of weather-related GA accident involvement. The analysis revealed several pilot and flight-related factors associated with increased risk of accident involvement. About 41% of accidents occurred at night and 59% during daylight. No surprise there, as it's much harder to avoid clouds at night than it is in the daytime. But here is a surprise. About 56% of these weather-related accidents were operating on an instrument flight plan, and 44% operated under VFR. So weather-related accidents don't just happen to VFR pilots. Accident pilots ranged in age from 23 to 81, with a mean age of 53, and all pilots but one were male. Accident pilot training records showed that the mean number of years as a pilot at the time of the accident was approximately 18 years, and the mean age at which accident pilots received their first pilot certificate was 35 years. Interviews were conducted with 135 pilots of matching non-accident flights. Non-accident study participants included 131 male and 4 female pilots, ranging in age from 19 to 74 years, with a mean age of 46 years. The mean number of years as a pilot was approximately 18 years for the non-accident group, and the mean age at which non-accident pilots received their first pilot certificate was 28 years. One of the key statistical differences between the groups was the age at which pilots received their first pilot certificate. The study found that pilots who received their pilot certificate at younger ages, 25 years and younger, were at lower risk of being in a weather-related accident. By contrast, those who got their certificates between ages 25 to 35 had 4.5 times the risk of having a weather-related accident compared to the youngest group. Pilots who got their certificates between age 35 to 45 had a risk about 4.8 times higher, and pilots who were age 45 and older had about 3.4 times greater risk of a weather-related accident. Thus, getting a pilot certificate later in life was correlated with a higher risk of having a weather-related accident. Now, this actually helps explain a rather confounding issue with the many studies that have tried to correlate a pilot's age with the risk of having an accident. These studies have had contradictory results. Some of them show that older pilots have more accidents, but some show the opposite. And some studies didn't show any effect of pilot age on the risk of having an accident. So this study may explain those seemingly contradictory results, because it found that weather-related accidents were not driven by a pilot's age at the time of the accident, but rather that accidents were driven by the age at which a pilot got their first pilot certificate. And by the way, the South Carolina accident pilot, who was 66, got his pilot certificate around 2005 when he would have been around 49 years old, so he fell squarely within a high-risk group. Another finding from the study was that pilots without an instrument rating were significantly more likely to be involved in weather-related accidents. For example, being non-instrument rated was associated with about a 4.8 times higher risk compared to instrument-rated pilots, which again makes sense, and the South Carolina pilot was not instrument rated. Another finding from the study was that flights of greater distance were associated with higher risk. For example, flights of 50 to 150 nautical miles were 2.9 times more likely to result in a weather-related accident compared to flights of less than 50 miles. Flights greater than 300 miles were 4.7 times more likely. The flight from Maine to Florida was, of course, more than 1,000 miles, putting it in the highest risk category. Another finding was that the accident group pilots were less likely to have certain weather briefing behaviors or perhaps less robust training or refresher training focused on weather hazards. So not surprisingly, pilots who get into weather don't seem to be as good as accessing and evaluating weather information. The study also showed that pilots who have an accident are more likely to have previously had an accident or incident. The study found that 19% of accident pilots had an accident or incident before the study accident. In 4 of these cases, the event included in the study was the pilot's third recorded mishap. By contrast, a smaller proportion of pilots in the non-accident control group were ever involved in an accident or incident, and those differences were statistically significant. In addition to accidents and incidents, FAA records indicated that 6 of the 72 study accident pilots had civil aviation violations on their records, in contrast to only 3 of the 135 non-accident pilots. And here's something I found fascinating that I don't think I've ever read about before. Certainly, we all work hard to pass our pilot written exams and our check rides. But the reality is that some people do poorly on written exams, and some people fail multiple check rides. And I've always wondered, well, does that matter? Are the pilots who get higher scores on their writtens and who have failed very few check rides, are those pilots any safer? And for those of you who've scored high on your written exams and have passed most of your check rides, the answer is yes. Apparently it does matter. Knowledge and practical test records indicated that the accident pilots had a mean cumulative pass rate of 86% for knowledge tests. And for check rides, they had a mean cumulative pass rate of 84%, which, by the way, in school would correspond to a B letter grade. Pilots in the non-accident control group had a mean cumulative pass rate of 95% for knowledge tests, and for check rides, they had a mean cumulative pass rate of 95%, which of course would be a A letter grade. The study authors concluded that for check rides, this difference between accident and non-accident pilots was statistically significant. So pilots who passed most of their check rides had fewer accidents in this study. The difference in knowledge test pass rates between the groups was also statistically significant. So pilots who scored more poorly on written exams were more likely to be in the accident group. And that fits with a sense I've had when reading accident reports. For example, the Atlas Air 767 crash in Houston Bay had elements of that in its report. And the NTSB study that we're talking about cited the crash of a fatal accident on July 13, 2003, involving a Cessna 402C operated as an Air Sunshine commuter flight that ditched in the Atlantic following an in-flight engine failure. Here's the story on that pilot. A review of FAA records revealed that over a 15-year period, the pilot involved in that accident had failed 9 practical tests. Specifically, the pilot had failed 2 practical tests for his private, 1 practical test for his instrument, 1 practical test for his ATP, 2 practical tests for his flight instructor certificate, and get this, 3 practical tests for his instrument instructor certificate. The safety board concluded that the pilot had a history of below-average proficiency before the accident flight, including numerous failed FAA flight tests, which contributed to his inability to maintain maximum flight performance and reach land after the right engine failed. So, this should give you one more reason to study hard for your written exams and for your check rides. Now let's talk about ways to estimate visibility and cloud distances in flight. I discovered early in my flying career that we as pilots are not very good at noticing when visibility slowly degrades over a period of time. When I was a low-time private living in New Jersey, I decided it would be fun to fly to another state. So I flew from Hackettstown to the Great Barrington, Massachusetts airport, since it was the closest point in Massachusetts to New Jersey. I had about 160 hours total time, and my logbook says it took me an hour and 20 minutes to get there in a Cessna 150. I noted in the logbook that visibility going there was 25 miles. But as I got close to Great Barrington, I still remember being shocked to suddenly realize that visibility was much less than it was when I started the trip. My notes say that it went down to 10-mile visibility. But what stunned me was that during that flight, the visibility decreased so slowly that I never noticed it. It was like the proverbial frog in slowly warming water. And that's when I realized that humans and frogs are not good at noticing gradual change. So for years after that, I played a game in flight, which was I would periodically try to estimate the visibility. And what I discovered was that the more you do that, the better you get at estimating visibility, and the sooner you'll notice changing visibility. And by the way, I find it a little odd that the FAA requires us to know visibility and cloud distance minimums, but to my knowledge, there's no place where they talk about how to estimate these distances. So pilots are left to guess the visibility and cloud distances. Let's talk first about visibility. If you have something on the ground that's a known distance, perhaps maybe a 5,300-foot runway, that would be about 1 statute mile long. You can then mentally extend that runway multiple times to estimate how far you can see. That works well, but we often don't have a runway in sight. If you have a moving map and there's an object on the map that you can clearly see out the window, such as a town or a lake or an antenna tower, just move the pointer on your moving map to that object. And then somewhere on the screen, you should be able to read the distance to that object. If there's an airport nearby, you can listen to the AWOS or ATIS for that airport to find out what visibility they are reporting at the surface. Now, that may be different than what you're seeing from the air, but if you're traveling for some distance and do this at multiple airports, you may be able to notice a trend if the visibility is changing. You can also get a rough estimate of visibility by looking at the sharpness of the horizon and the terrain features. If there's a clear horizon and distinct shadows, you've got high visibility of greater than 10 miles. If there's a hazy horizon and the terrain is still distinguishable, well, that's moderate visibility of maybe 5 to 10 miles. If there's washed out terrain and the colors are blending, that may be marginal visibility of 3 to 5 miles. And if there's no defined horizon and kind of a milky view, that may be poor visibility of less than 3 miles. If you find that visibility is decreasing, then you need a personal minimum to tell you that it's time to execute your plan B. You do have a plan B, right? And if you have someone else in the airplane, you might want to share that trigger point with them so that they can help you identify it when it occurs and prod you to execute your plan B. Why is this important? Because pilots don't always do what they say they will do. Once on a trip bringing a Cirrus SR-22 from Richmond, Virginia to California with its new owner, we stopped in Amarillo, Texas, where I felt we should stop for the night. The weather was expected to degrade, nightfall was approaching, and we would be flying over an area with relatively few airports. The owner, however, wanted to press on. And I let him do this because I thought, it probably won't work out, and it could be a good learning moment for him. What I said to him was, okay, we can press on, but the moment we see any lightning, we're going to turn back. Well, we took off and soon after saw lightning, but the pilot continued to fly on. I had to say, hey, we agreed we'd turn back if we saw any lightning, because it was clear that if I hadn't said anything, he would have continued flying. He finally turned back, and we had to fly southeast to avoid the approaching storm, landing in Abilene, Texas, where we spent the night. In our case, the trigger was if we saw lightning. In your case, your trigger might be if visibility decreases to 5 miles, or whatever limit you want to set for yourself. And then your plan B might be to continue to the nearest airport or to turn back to an airport that's behind you. Regardless, you should determine your trigger point and your plan B before you take off and share it with your co-pilot or passengers so they can help you identify when those triggers occur. Now let's talk about estimating cloud distances. One method is similar to what we discussed for visibility, and that is if you're flying past a series of airports, you can listen to the AWOS or ATIS for that airport to find out what the cloud bases are. Then if you're in Class C airspace, below 10,000 feet, choose an altitude that's at least 500 feet below the reported cloud bases. Remember that the bottom of clouds are not always even, so you may have to be even lower to remain 500 feet below the clouds. And here's a method that you can use anywhere. You don't have to be close to an airport. I've never read about this anywhere, but I created it and wrote it up 20 years ago when the FAA was producing a guide for conducting flight reviews. They included it in the appendix. And that is that you can use trigonometry. No, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's really fairly simple. Everyone knows approximately what a 45-degree angle looks like. And you might recall that a right triangle includes two 45-degree angles and a 90-degree angle. And because two of the angles are equal, two of the triangle legs are also of equal length. And here's how we can apply that knowledge when we're flying to measure distance to a cloud. Imagine you're flying below the clouds, and you need to be at least 500 feet below the clouds. If you look up ahead of you and up at a 45-degree angle, identify a point on the clouds that's at a 45-degree angle up from your airplane and your projected line of level flight. If you stay level, and the cloud bases stay level, the distance you travel forward to get under that point will be the same as the vertical distance to the clouds above you. In other words, you're forming an invisible right triangle. Your seat in the plane is at one point, the 45-degree point you identified on the cloud is another point, and the third point is directly below it on your future flight path. Then to determine the vertical distance to the cloud, use a timer to see how long it takes you to get to fly to a point directly under that 45-degree point that you identified on the cloud. Let's say you're in a Cessna 172 and your ground speed is 100 knots. If the clouds are 500 feet above you, it should take you 3 seconds until you're right under that point you identified on the cloud ahead of you that was up at a 45-degree angle. If it takes you longer than 3 seconds to get there, then you're more than 500 feet below the clouds. But if it takes you less than 3 seconds to get there, then you're less than 500 feet below the clouds. If you're flying in a Cirrus or a Bonanza at 170 knots, then your time to reach the point below the clouds is 1.7 seconds. You can use the same method to determine how far horizontally you are from a cloud. When flying parallel to a cloud on your right, look 45 degrees ahead and to the right, and identify a point on the cloud at your altitude. Then, time how long it takes you to get directly abeam that point. At 100 knots, it should take you 12 seconds to get to that point if the cloud is 2,000 feet away. At 170 knots, it should take you 7 seconds to come abeam of the point you identified on the cloud. If it takes you longer than 12 seconds or 7 seconds to get there, well, you're more than 2,000 feet away from the clouds. And here are a few more thoughts on the South Carolina accident. Fatigue apparently was an issue. And when pilots are fatigued, our decision-making in flight isn't as good. On the prior day, the pilot was in the air or refueling for nearly 10 hours. Doing that much hand flying in one day is exhausting. So for longer trips, try to use an airplane with an autopilot or bring someone else along who can do some of the flying. You'll recall an airport employee said the pilot appeared tired and that he could see, quote, fatigue in his eyes. Rather than camping out on a couch, it might be worth getting a hotel room just so you get better sleep and are less fatigued. Food is also important. Studies show that when glucose levels are low, people make poor decisions. Now, we know the pilot had Uber Eats sometime between 8 and 8:30 the night before, but we don't know what, if anything, he ate the following day before he crashed at 12:51 p.m. For long trips, bring food with you. It's often difficult to find food quickly at GA airports, and it's much easier to just pack the food you want to eat and bring it with you. And finally, monitor the weather in flight and continually estimate your visibility and cloud distances. Then if you get to your predetermined trigger levels, or even before you get to them, execute your plan B or C. Now, I hope you learned something from this episode, and if you would, please share it with all of your pilot friends, especially those who fall into some of the risk categories that we talked about. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset. and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can